Can you talk a little bit about what drew you specifically to writing crime fiction and how that differs from sort of much of your other work? And maybe Harini, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, as some of you know, I'm an ecologist, and for the past 15, 16 years, I've been working on the history of Bangalore, the ecological history of Bangalore. And my foray into starting to write fiction came when I had masses of archival material. Some of it was just so rich and so interesting that it just wouldn't fit into a non-fiction book, but it had to go somewhere. And crime is what I love reading, so it's sort of started with that. And the main protagonist was a spunky woman in 1920s Bangalore, landed in my head and demanded that I write about her. So it took me 14 years to get to learn how to write fiction, because you write non-fiction tight, you write it to word counts, you write it linear. It's a very different style of narration. And then so it took me a while to figure out how to do both of them in parallel. But now that I've done that, it's been a very interesting journey, and one that I don't think I would trade for anything else.
I have loved crime fiction, reading crime fiction since I was a child. And then my first book was very definitely not science fiction, crime fiction. It was in the magic realist mode. And then my second book, which was a collection of short stories, I was trying to experiment with forms that I loved, right? So there was a ghost story, and there was a story about social warfare on Malabar Hill. And then I wanted to write a cop story, a cop procedural. So I did that, which was great fun. And then I've lived in Bombay for many, many years. And as you know, the growth of organized crime in Bombay in the 80s and 90s was insane. Gunfights exploding on the streets. And my family's all in the film industry, so as you also must know, one of the great streams of revenue for the maid guys, for the bhais, is extortion from the film industry. And if you don't pay up, they will kill you, right? Or at least try. So people I knew, including my brother-in-law, Vinod Chopra, who's a producer and director, got these threats, and Vidhu and family lived for 2 years under armed police guard. So I just got curious. And so the protagonist of the cop story, Sartaj Singh, was there for me. And so I just started to write about something that I had gotten curious about and ended up writing a big book.
Oh, well, I blame David Lynch, especially Twin Peaks, which I grew up watching. It beamed into my lounge room every Thursday night and kind of changed my life. But that was what we probably call psycho-noir. I did then start teaching noir film and fiction at university and submerge myself in that history. And I realized by reading and absorbing a lot of the history of noir, including Raymond Chandler and some of those writers, that it was indeed a very masculine world, and I really wanted to screw around with some of the noir tropes, particularly the idea of the femme fatale and what we think about when we think about the femme fatale. And I heard a story about a young woman on the Gold Coast, where I live in Australia, I live on the Gold Coast, and it's kind of a shady town. They call it a sunny place for shady people. So I heard a story about her, Jade, her name was, and she conned the con men of the Gold Coast. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting character. So I learnt more about her. And what she did was invent personalities in a very transient city, and none of her worlds connected to each other. But the interesting thing about Jade was that she believed in all her different personalities. And I found that fascinating, that her inventions got so elaborate that she started to believe that she was these people. And then I just started writing the book. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, with me, it began with a character. I had this character in my mind, Inspector Gowda. And until then, I'd been writing about Kerala and rural and suburban India pretty much, which is Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And I had this character, Inspector Gowda, in my head, and I didn't know what to do with him. And I think he demanded that I write this crime novel built around him. And I had this character also of, so there were two parallel characters that floated into my head. One was Inspector Gowda riding 350cc bullet, a Royal Enfield bullet. And on the other hand, I also had this image of this transvestite dressing up. And it was, how am I going to bring these two characters together and what am I going to do with them? And it just seemed kind of an organic fit that the story should be set in Bangalore with a name like, Gowda. It couldn't be anywhere else. And yeah, so I think that's how it just so happened. It was really, I would think, happenstance more than anything else.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about not just Bangalore, but the cities and places so much of crime fiction is set, because it seems essential to modern day crime fiction that when we're reading, we're not just reading about the characters, we're reading about a specific place and often a specific time. Like Harini's book is in the 1920s, Vikram's book is in the 80s and 90s, I believe, in Bombay. So it's not just an exploration of a crime and the ramifications of that crime, but of a place and the time in which that crime is set. And anyone want to take that? Start with.
Well, yes, crime fiction has always been connected to place. If you think about the connection of noir to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles was is perceived as a very make-believe and a place of invention, and it lends itself to this kind of romantic or melancholy idea of noir and a city that's changeable. And so it's embedded very deeply in the history of crime fiction, the idea of place. With Atomic City, I used the city of the Gold Coast as it had its own voice. So the city would tell the story. Because the city, with Jade, because she was so crazy and she had so many different personalities, I found trying to write from her perspective very chaotic. So I wrote from the perspective of the city. And so the city can foresee, and the city can tell you the story of the past, and therefore you can control the unfolding of the mystery perhaps a little more elaborately than you can do from the first person perspective. And so I found that really interesting. So if a city had a voice, what would it sound like?
I mean, one of the wonderful things about noir crime fiction, the detective novel, is that it lets you move vertically across a culture, right? So you start in the, I don't know, among the poor, for instance, right? And then through that series of connections, you find out that the mayor is responsible for the murder, right? And then you can move horizontally, you explore, I don't know, one culture, one kind of speech in this part of town, and then you move across town, and now you're in South Bombay among the rich and famous, and then you suddenly back in the Basti in Dharavi. And that allows you to connect all these things together and contrast them and link them in all kinds of ways. And I think the detective, the modern investigator, right from the beginning with Edgar Allan Poe's stories, has been a flaneur, right? Yeah, a wanderer in the city, especially at night, right? And then Sherlock Holmes, who doesn't know about, I don't know, he has no irrelevant knowledge, so he doesn't know whether the moon goes around the earth or something, but he knows every nook and cranny of London, right? And it's beautiful in that way because it lets you, in a really entertaining way, do a kind of socio-cultural investigation.
I think it's very much about class and the collisions of class groups. And Chandler did that so well. You know, I mean, those wonderful scenes where he'd walk into some mansion, you know, and that's the whole thing in Chinatown as well, you know.
I think it's also for me about being able to talk about what's happening in terms of social commentary because when I write literary fiction, I find that I'm delving very deep into the mindscapes of the characters. But when I'm writing noir, I find that what is outside fashions the character, and what happens to the character as a result of the societal patterns and everything that exists. So it allowed me actually to talk about the city, talk about the different levels of the society. So in terms of like, if I mostly write about North and East Bangalore. I mean, I don't have the gumption to write about South and West Bangalore because I don't know it at all, but I do know North and East Bangalore very well. So I know like the alleys and streets, and I know the little villages that exist within the city and so on. So when I write about it, to me, I feel that there is this authentic ring that comes in where I'm able to use the city or that part of the city as a character as much as the protagonist and all the other characters. So I think the city has a huge role to play in, or the place has a huge role to play in pretty much every piece of noir writing that emerges in some form or the other.
I wrote a book set in 1920s Bangalore because I think like all Bangaloreans, I love old Bangalore, and that sort of conjures a nostalgia and a feeling of those times. And for me, if I'm thinking of Sally's description of a city as a place, if Bangalore was a person, then she would be a young, opinionated woman, but also someone warm and comfortable. And I read noir, but I don't write noir. I write sort of cozy domestic mysteries, classic golden age mysteries. So to me, the golden age was really a beautiful setting for Bangalore because there was so much to explore. There was, you know, the women were fighting for the right for suffrage, for voting, and they were talking to people, women in Sri Lanka, they were talking to women in the UK, in the US, and exchanging notes. And there's also, of course, as the ecologist and the geographer, the map of Bangalore that I wanted to bring alive, and the ecology of the cantonment Bangalore versus Alsur and the cowherds and the different parts of the cities. So I'd say the city is very much a character for me, but also the ecology of the city is what brings it really alive for me.
On that point, though, how real do you feel your cities are? Because, you know, when you think of like the classic noir novels, you know, they're Los Angeles or whatever, you know, but they're all, you know, the contrast is turned way up, you know, the way people talk was not really how people talked on the street. The way they acted was not really how people acted on the street, but it was all an attempt to create a particular world and a particular sense of a moral universe. Which, you know, the writers wanted to write about. I'm just curious how you all relate a little bit to the reality or maybe the unreality of your creations or of those characters who are cities for you.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, excuse me, noir fiction is extremely stylized. You know, if you think about Humphrey Bogart playing the detective and the way he moves, even the way he moves is really stylized, and it's an aesthetic, it's a mood, you know. Noir is a mood and a flavor that's not necessarily, even though it says that it's dealing in reality, it is in fact dealing with a stylization of a reality. And then when you get to neo and post-noir, it's layered on even thicker, you know, because it's an imitation of an imitation of an imitation. And so you get to something like Blade Runner, which is considered to be a post-noir vision of Los Angeles. You know, and I love how noir, as it goes through history, talks to itself. You know, it is about itself.
Yeah. So, Sacred Games, I think, I don't know if I'd describe it at all as noir. To me, even as I was writing it, it felt much more that like something that came from the 19th century novel, right? Both Indian and Victorian, kind of large landscape. My favorite Victorian novelist is Anthony Trollope, right? So trying to do that kind of thing. So, I mean, as to the question of how stylized it is, I don't think I was consciously trying to make it stylized, but I mean, of course, I knew that it's a map, not the territory, right? So in some sense, it moves diagonally in terms of representing reality. And then, you know, I like to fill up that book and other books as well with some kind of sensory detail. So I think that worked a lot in the book.
So the way I see it is that what I write is pretty much police procedurals more than anything else. But what I try and do is work in my style of writing, which is what I write regularly. So it's a combination of trying to write a police procedural with, I would think, highbrow writing to some extent without making it seem distant. So the challenge, of course, is that, for many of us who've grown up watching or are even to this day watching a lot of crime that is set in the Western world, the contrast when you're writing a police procedural in India is so different because everything is different, right down to the way an investigation is done, to whether you even have yellow tapes marking a crime scene. So all of that, so that changes it to some extent. And I think it brings in a certain grittiness, which doesn't exist otherwise in a lot of crime writing that happens. And when you're writing crime set in India, it has a certain earthiness to it. It has a certain, because also most of the characters are not speaking English. They're speaking a language which is probably Pidgin English. It's probably a mixture of Hindi and Kannada and Tamil. So there are multiple languages that are coming in. So the cadence of the writing itself changes depending on who the character is and what the character is saying. So it's very challenging. It's very different, I would think.
Yeah, and add that last layer of, I think if you're presenting historical crime through a current lens of morality, then there's some things you always will change. For instance, some things that were assumed that were sort of obvious at the time, which were kosher, so to speak, would not be so kosher today. And so you are always, if you're especially looking at historical fiction writer, making this trade-off between what can I write that will vibe with readers of the times, but will be believable with the reader, with a historical. And there are times when the facts contradict with the logic of a rollicking good story. And I think in that case, you take the logic of a rollicking good story, but you just write in the footnotes that, here, I've changed this. This would not have been like this in those times, but I've changed it to fit my story. So.
Yeah, thank you. In thinking about sort of writing crime fiction, outside of, say, the UK, outside of Scandinavia, where in Scandinavia everything is so clean and, the police come and they're all sort of very professional and, or seemingly professional. What's it like, as Anita was saying, about this grittiness, this earthiness, of writing crime fiction in India? What do you feel are the major differences? Or what do you feel writing about it in India also or in Australia gives you that writing within sort of the traditional sort of sphere of crime fiction would not give you? Anybody, please?
Well, I mean, if you're writing about crime in India and investigation in India, you centrally have to deal with corruption, right? And how money moves and who gets the money. I mean, for instance, in the TV series, they had Sartaj being an honest cop, which in the book he is not, right? I mean, he's very careful not to take above a certain amount of money, but he takes minor amounts because if you want to survive as a cop in Bombay, that's what you do, right? And I'm sometimes surprised that in the movies there's much more of this, right? But when I read, and in the Hindi crime fiction that I read growing up, that was there. But in some Anglophone detective stories and so forth, there's none of that. I'm like, I don't recognize this landscape.
I think some of the most interesting work is coming out of places like Mexico and Japan and Korea. I mean, look what happened with Parasite, What an incredible crime film. Because these cultures are speaking back to the dominance of the American vision. And that's part of noir's development in history as well. I mean, the Mexican stuff is incredible. Yuri Herrera, he knows what the history of noir is, but he's twisting it, and he's outside the engine room looking in, and it gives it this grittiness, this vitality, this different kind of voice, and at the same time, it's a critique of American culture or American dominance of Mexico.
Yeah, I'm reading this novel by Fernanda Melchor right now, the second of her books I'm reading. I'm not sure, I think you would call, or you certainly could call them crime novels, but they're extraordinary, just frenetic, just so fast-paced, so gritty, so intense. Yeah, just sort of incredible books. Anyhow, sorry.
So, if I'm thinking, I really love the flowering of Indian crime literature because I think crime fiction is the most accessible way of transporting yourself to different places. And I think, Vikram's books, Anita's books, mine, Abir Mukherjee, Wasim Khan, Parveen Mistry, I think they're really helping people look at India in a much richer way and taking people towards understanding Indian cities through the lens of crime fiction. But I'm also very happy with the number of new authors who are now writing women-centered crime fiction, which I think is something that was historically lacking for a long time. Having strong women protagonists is something that is really nice because you can also see how women navigated Indian society because you always had to navigate it. It didn't come to you, but that didn't mean strong women didn't exist. It just meant that they knew how to navigate the interstices and work their ways through.
Add one thing. I think when we talk about, even on this stage, when we are talking about fiction, crime fiction, and current state of India, we think of Anglophone English science crime fiction written in English, right? And there's a very, very old tradition of crime and detective, as we all know, right? Of course, there's Satyajit Ray and then his predecessors. In Hindi, there was actually a very, very active, and still is, of pulp crime fiction. Literally, you remember those books that used to be sold on railway stations, right? Yeah. On really cheap paper, and that Pulp Fiction, and it was gritty, and it had corruption in it, yeah. Bad cops, bad politicians, right? And then more recently, there was that terrific anthology of translation of Tamil pulp fiction.
The Bluffed one.
The Bluffed one, right? And I think all of that, much more of that needs to happen, at least for me, from Tamil and other languages.
In our conversation before this panel, we were talking a little bit about the American television series The Wire and how, as a show, it each season sort of navigates through a different level of crime within the city of Baltimore and sort of works with increasingly sort of trenchant social commentary and really just sort of x-rays this city in this very brutal light. And Anita, you talked earlier about social commentary and the contemporary crime novel. Can we talk a little bit about how you feel your works or other works relate to critiques of sort of contemporary society and how that works? Anybody?
Yes, and I think it allows me to really, or any crime writer, when you are writing about crime, you're talking about what causes crime. You're starting off with a fundamental thing there. And then you can actually talk about the various inequalities that exist in the society. And you can talk about it. And it's not about actually pointing fingers, but it's just about presenting things and saying, look, this is how it is. And this is probably the reason why these things are happening. So, for instance, I did this book on child trafficking. The last Gowda novel that I did was on child trafficking. And when I started my research, I didn't know, for instance, that Bangalore had turned into a hub of trafficking. Until then, it was just one of the transit points. But over the years, because the city had changed and there were so many migrant workers here, obviously, like one of the senior cops told me, men have their needs. And so, children were being trafficked, young girls, 14-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and so on. They were being trafficked, and all of this was happening right under our noses, and none of us know about it because it's not part of our life. It's not part of newspaper reports. I mean, somewhere there is a newspaper report saying 20 girls were found, and they were, after a raid, 20 girls were rescued. But what happens to them thereafter? None of that comes out. So I think when I write crime, what it does for me is, I think in some ways it also helps me feel that I'm doing my tiny little bit to assuage my own social conscience more than anything else. And I'm sure that there is somewhere in each crime writer this need to talk about what is happening outside and beyond, and not just with the characters alone.
Yeah, I also think that we need space too for darkness and for violence and for those shadier parts of human nature which are a part of all of us, and that crime fiction doesn't necessarily have to be moralistic. It doesn't necessarily have to be solving societal issues. Sometimes the most popular stuff is when the criminal is actually the hero, you know, and we're attracted to that. We wouldn't admit it necessarily to ourselves sometimes, but sometimes we're on the side of the crim, yeah? And we love going into that territory. So it does both, I think. It does, you know, it makes these critiques, but sometimes we fall in love with the anti-hero.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, do we really? Right? We get to participate and get the yummy thrills, and then, you know, often they're punished at the end, which satisfied our moral urge.
Yeah, we get, they kind of put the twist in the end, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think like you're talking about The Wire, I think that's one of the great novels of the 21st century, really, in the Victorian sense, right? And what they do there is the first season explores the drug trade. Another of the seasons explores, I don't know, the ports, the crumbling ports, and then
the union crime in the ports, and then like the corruption, City Hall.
Right, education, right?
Yeah.
So by the time you've finished all the seasons, you've got this education in the entire city, right? And I think that's one of the traditional pleasures of reading this kind of fiction, is that you get to explore something that you don't know about, right? So, you know, murder at the academy. There's a whole genre of like academics killing each other, you know, which we don't do that often, but we certainly have the urge to do it, right? So by the time you finish reading one of those novels, you've gotten a kind of education into how academia works, right? In a really entertaining way. I mean,
so it's a fantasy.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And then, you know, one of my favorite titles ever for a mystery was "Who is Killing the Great Chefs of Europe?" And, you know, I've never managed to find a copy of that, but how could you not want to read it, right? Because by the time that you finish, you'll get an education in the food industry, high-end food industry.
Murder Master Chef.
What I'm finding fascinating is, I think, the range of reasons for which people read crime and the kinds of things, like the anti-hero, for instance, or the police procedural where you're trying to get justice, or, you know, the kind of books that I like to read, which I wrote, therefore, which are the comforting books where you know, curl up on a couch and sit there in the evening and you're a little scared, but it's still very domestic. So I have a lot of recipes in cooking and food and I think that's also why I write about the past, because it's easy to reconjure the past as this wonderful time where everything was right, where justice was served, where things were golden. And we all know that's not true, of course, but that's the, you know. So from that to the complete noir spectrum or to The Wire, I think it's a spectrum that has something for everyone, and that's what I find very nice about crime.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you know, with The Wire, going back to The Wire, sort of the whole series paints a picture of Baltimore trapped in this brutal, self-defeating system where everyone is essentially crushed, no matter how optimistic or hopeful or sort of energetic they are. And that's, and it's not noir, it feels very realist, which is maybe more scary. But, you know, one of the things when I was, you know, a teenager and, you know, later, I never really understood this term noir. When I was young, I thought it meant black and white movies. But I'd love for each of you, or any of you, if not all of you, but just to talk a little bit about what you think this term noir means, because I think it's become weirdly more and more important as time goes on within the broader culture as a sort of as a style, not just of writing but of filmmaking, of arts in general. And I'd love to hear if you personally have a definition or an outlook on this word, noir.
Well, the beauty of that is that noir is always changing, and so. You know, we had Neo, Post, Psycho. You know, what's next? I think we're still in the process of making what's next. And I think a lot of the women writers are challenging some of those, you know, cliches. One of my favorite books is In the Cut by Susanna Moore. And she said she read the history of American noir fiction, and she said, God, these guys really can't write sex. And so she decided, I'm gonna take this on, you know. And you may have seen the film by Jane Campion. It's a beautiful, sexy film. It's got a very different view of what noir is. And I think it still needs to be challenged and played with. And so it's ongoing. I don't think we can put a pin in it.
Yeah, I think somebody needs to start doing scholarship on the new Indian television UP Bihar noir, right? You know, you wanna, and it's starting to, I mean, there are certain tropes that become common, right? In every form, in any fictional form. But in noir, in America, for instance, right? There's, I mean, even there's the Boulevardier, right? That's always been there. So I've been trying to think about what the tropes of UP Bihar noir are, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also very interesting to see, for instance, Kannada films now have so much of, you know, crime-related movies which are very interesting and very different in terms of ethos and pattern and description. But I also find, I think there are, I mean, speaking to the way noir's evolving, there's also so much now looking at feminist ways of reinterpreting crime fiction which are about the heroine story, not the hero story. So there's no, I mean, the hero or heroine does not have to be male or female, but it's just that, do you have one leader, do you have a collective that is driving? And noir has always been the classic hero story or the anti-hero story. But reinterpreting noir as a heroine story with collectives, I think, is getting very interesting now. So that's...
Well, we have multiplicity now across all genres, you know. So it's not about Humphrey Bogart going down the street in his trench coat and his trilby, you know, the loner in the city. It's often an ensemble, like it is in The Wire. You know, we have a multiplicity of characters, and that allows variation of representation, character, perspective. So that's really exciting as well, but more difficult to write, you know. Yeah.
Just one quick question for Vikram about because you mentioned that in the novel, Sartaj Singh, he's a corrupt, much more complex character, and he becomes much more heroic in the television series. Can you talk a little bit about how that process of moving the book from a novel to a TV series worked for you?
I was attached to the series as an executive producer, which anybody in the film industry knows. It's kind of a throwaway title. It can mean anything and nothing. But my function was to read the drafts of the episodes, and they would send me those, and I would send back hundreds of notes, and they would ignore most of them. But I mean, like translating from one language to the other, you have to make really dramatic leaps, right? It's film language as opposed to text. Right? And so I was really happy with what they ended up doing. Some of the things they did, I could never have imagined because I was so stuck inside the text version of that universe.
Like, what were some of the things you were happy about? I'm just curious, like some of the changes.
Oh, I mean, the one that was marvelous that I think everybody liked was Cuckoo, right? The Kubra Seth, right? The character played by Kubra Seth, Gaitonde's lover, right? So in the book, she never appears live, as it were. Sartaj and Kartikar are on a stakeout, and they're telling cop stories, right? And so Kartikar tells this story about a dancer in a bar who is stunning, and everyone's in love with her, and a cop who falls desperately in love with her. And so when they sent me the drafts, I was like, wow, how did you pick that one character from 900 pages, right? It's astonishing and so great.
I'd love to hear more about how, because at the heart of so much crime fiction is this usually this complex, interesting detective, or not. In your case, it's a couple, and it's but they're the personalities that drive these stories forward. And could you talk a little bit about how you come to create these characters and what goes into imagining these people's lives a little bit? Anybody?
I open actually with the 1921 Kaveri, my protagonist, who's 19-year-old housewife, just moved to Bangalore, swimming in a sari. And she goes to Century Club to the swimming pool and swims in a sari. And that was a characteristic scene that was actually an amalgam of different things. My husband's aunt, who's 96 now, who swam in the 1930s in the Madras Club in a sari. And other, my mother's grandmother, who was an Ayurvedic Vaid who delivered babies of strangers in the middle of the night, would go somewhere, come back. So there were all these interesting women that I heard about through oral histories, and Kaveri came really fully formed. Then I had to create a husband for her because a woman, the reality of a woman in 1920s India is that she couldn't go everywhere. So she had to have a husband who would navigate some spaces and she would navigate some spaces, and together they would be able to solve the mystery. So there was part that came fully formed and there was part that had to be added on for the sake of the story.
Anita? How you came to create Inspector Gowda?
I'd been writing quite extensively about women and women-centric stories, and even if it wasn't women-centric, a woman always had a kind of pivotal role to play in it. And it just so happened that every time I would do a kind of European tour for one of the books, there would be this classic question that every journalist would ask me: what is the condition of women in India? And it would just get to me because I remember at the end of a book tour for Lessons in Forgetting, which was about female feticide more than anything else, there was this point where I was sick and tired of actually talking about the condition of women in India, because nothing much has changed. So much has changed and nothing much has changed. So it's the same story that I'm repeating again and again when I'm talking to journalists. So I remember that my son and I were traveling at that time together, and I was just kind of sitting outside in a cafe and moaning to him about how sick and tired I was about talking about the condition of women in India. And he, for a lark, said, why don't you just, write about maybe a transvestite person and see what happens, So that's how it began. I had this image of this man dressing up as a woman in front of a mirror like the one that actors have with bulbs studded around it and so on. And then it was like I had Gowda in my mind, who was just floating, independently. And this whole story of how do I bring Gowda and this man dressing up as a woman together? What do I do with them? Where do I take them? Where do I set the story? And I think that's how Cut Like Wound was born, really.
Either of you, Sally or Vikram?
Well, I guess I can tell you what my next book is going to be. When I get home, I'm going to be going undercover with the Gold Coast Police. So if you never see me again, it's been nice knowing you. I will be writing about the detective, because I've done so much study of the detective in fiction and film. I wanted to hang out with some detectives, both men and women, and really look at what it's like to be a real detective, not just one in a film. And I want to write a creative non-fiction about that. But yeah, we'll see what happens. I can't believe they let me in, actually.
We're getting closer to the end, but I know both Harini, you have a new book coming out next year in the same series, and also Anita has a new book. Would either of you would like to? And do you have another? Are you going to be returning to Sartaj Singh at any point?
No.
A very concise answer. I'd love to hear more about the new books in your series, if you'd like.
So Murder Under a Red Moon is the next book in my series, which comes out next year. And it has Kaveri sleuthing forward at the time of a lunar eclipse, which is a blood red moon. And it also has, in the first book, she has an awkward relationship with her mother-in-law because she's an independent young woman, and her mother-in-law believes that too much studying makes a woman's brains go soft and wants us to stay at home. And in the second book, you really have to figure out, because in India, especially India of the 1920s, you didn't just marry your husband, you married the whole family. So does she get along with her? Does she not get along with her is the backdrop. Alongside, you have this sleuthing under the red moon.
Yeah, so I happened to meet somebody who was telling me about the illegal fights that take place in Bangalore. And until then, I didn't know that illegal fights took place in Bangalore. And yeah, and then I had to write about it. So it's about this ring of men who have these illegal fights. And yeah, and Gowda has to do everything to find out. And because the thing is that the reality is it does exist, and nobody knows about it except the ones who are involved in it, the guys, the bookies and the fighters and the people who organize it. So even though the police know about it and there is a raid, by the time the raid happens, the fight is over. So
Have you been able to visit one of these fights?
well, no, but this friend of mine who used to be a fighter, he could give me the kind of, dope that nobody else would, actually.
I mean, no disrespect to the Bangalore police. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but somebody's getting paid off.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think we have to close up now. And thank you all very much. And thank you.